The biting wind swept across the frozen expanse of Glacier Lake, cutting through every layer of clothing Daniel had donned for his afternoon hike. The serenity of the Montana winter was breathtaking, but the bone-chilling cold served as a harsh reminder of its danger. Max, his ever-loyal German shepherd, trotted ahead, his breath visible in the frigid air. Daniel had come to trust Max's instincts implicitly, which was why he immediately tensed when the dog stopped, his ears pricking up at an unseen disturbance. "What is it, boy?" Daniel called, quickening his pace. Max let out a sharp bark, his nose pointing toward the distant shoreline. Without hesitation, Daniel followed the direction of Max's gaze, his heart pounding as he approached the source of the dog's agitation. Near the edge of the lake, a figure lay crumpled in the snow, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. A puppy, no more than a few weeks old, was barely visible against the frosty backdrop, its small frame trembling weakly. The pup's thick, fluffy coat of white and gray fur, marked with striking facial patterns typical of a husky, was matted with ice. Its faint, labored breaths barely disturbed the cold air. Max nudged the little dog gently with his nose, whining as though urging it to stay alive. Daniel's heart twisted at the sight. Dropping to his knees, he examined the tiny pup, its icy blue eyes half closed as if on the verge of surrender. "Where did you find him, Max?" he murmured, though he knew there'd be no answer. The urgency in Max's actions spoke volumes. The shepherd had found this fragile life and brought Daniel to it, knowing that time was critical. Wrapping his scarf around the puppy, Daniel carefully lifted it into his arms. Its small body was shockingly cold, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might be too late. "Hang on, little one," he whispered, his voice trembling. Max paced anxiously beside him as they made their way back to the cabin, the German shepherd's every movement radiating protectiveness. Once inside, the warmth of the fireplace enveloped them like a lifeline. Daniel quickly laid the pup on a soft blanket near the hearth, his hands trembling as he fetched towels to dry the matted fur. Max sat close, his eyes never leaving the puppy, as though silently willing it to survive. Daniel worked meticulously, speaking softly to the pup all the while. "You're safe now," he murmured, rubbing the tiny body gently to generate warmth. The puppy's shallow breathing seemed to grow steadier, and after a long, tense moment it let out a faint, high-pitched whimper. Relief washed over Daniel. "That's it," he said, smiling despite the tears threatening to spill. "You're a fighter." Max leaned in, nuzzling the pup with the utmost care. The sight was one Daniel would never forget, a bond forming between his brave shepherd and the little life they had just saved. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the cabin was filled with an unspoken promise. They would do everything they could to ensure the pup had a second chance. The cabin glowed with the warm light of the fireplace, and for the first time since moving to Montana, Daniel felt the space truly come alive. He placed another log on the fire, the crackle of the flames a comforting backdrop to the fragile husky lying on the thick blanket near the hearth. Max, ever vigilant, sat close by, his deep brown eyes fixed intently on the tiny creature. It was as if he understood the enormity of what they had just done. Daniel knelt beside the pup, examining it more closely now that the immediate danger of the cold was gone. Its dense fur, still damp but noticeably softening under the heat, was a beautiful mix of white and gray, accented by the sharp contrast of its black markings. The pup's icy blue eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Daniel's gaze with a look so vulnerable it made his chest tighten. "You're tougher than you look," he said softly, running a gentle hand over its tiny frame. The puppy let out a faint whimper in response, its tail twitching slightly. Max let out a low whine and leaned closer, sniffing the pup with gentle curiosity. "Looks like you've made a new friend, Max," Daniel said with a smile. The shepherd's tail wagged once, his approval clear. As the hours passed, the puppy grew stronger. Daniel offered it small sips of warm water from a bowl, holding it carefully as it drank. When it seemed ready, he mashed some soft food into a makeshift meal, which the puppy devoured with an eagerness that made him laugh. "There's a fighter in you, isn't there?" he said, his voice tinged with admiration. The storm outside continued to howl, snow piling against the windows and blanketing the world beyond the cabin in an endless white. But inside, the three of them had found an unspoken camaraderie, a shared understanding that they were stronger together. Daniel decided then and there that the husky wasn't just a visitor, it was family now. By evening, the puppy was moving around, albeit unsteadily. Max stayed close, nosing it gently whenever it stumbled. Daniel watched the two of them with a sense of wonder. "You're already teaching him, aren't you?" he said to Max, who glanced back as if to say, "Of course." With the pup settled in a makeshift bed lined with an old sweater, Daniel sat back on the couch, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. Max jumped up to sit beside him, his head resting on Daniel's lap. "We've got our work cut out for us," Daniel murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. "But if anyone can help him thrive, it's you." As the night wore on, Daniel found his thoughts drifting to the events of the day. How had the puppy ended up alone in the woods? The area was remote, with no nearby homes or towns that could explain its presence. The thought that someone might have abandoned such a helpless creature filled him with anger. He glanced over at the pup, now fast asleep with Max curled protectively around it. Whatever its past, Daniel knew its future would be different. The sound of the storm began to fade, replaced by the gentle crackle of the fire. Daniel leaned back, letting the warmth lull him into a peaceful state. Beside him, Max let out a contented sigh, his body rising and falling in sync with the soft breaths of the husky. Before closing his eyes, Daniel whispered into the quiet, "We'll figure it all out tomorrow. For now, you're safe." The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where life could begin anew. The next morning, the husky puppy was awake before Daniel. Small, tentative sounds of claws clicking against the cabin floor woke him, and as his eyes adjusted to the warm glow of sunlight spilling through the curtains, he found the little pup sniffing its way around the room. Max, ever the watchful guardian, followed close behind, his tail wagging slowly as he monitored the puppy's curious exploration. Daniel stretched and swung his legs off the couch, his lips curling into a smile at the sight of Max gently nudging the pup away from a precarious pile of books near the fireplace. "Good morning, you two," he said, his voice still groggy. The husky perked up at the sound of his voice, tilting its head in that endearing way only huskies seem to do. The pup's icy blue eyes locked onto Daniel's, and it padded over to him with newfound energy, letting out a tiny, high-pitched bark. "Well, look who's feeling better," Daniel chuckled, scooping the pup into his arms. The dense coat of gray and white fur was now clean and warm, and the puppy wriggled slightly, trying to nuzzle closer. "You're going to fit in just fine around here," he murmured, scratching behind its ears. Max approached, leaning his large frame into Daniel's side and sniffing the pup with what seemed like approval. "You're setting a good example, Max," Daniel said, smiling as the German shepherd licked the puppy's nose. It was clear that Max had taken on the role of protector and mentor, guiding the little one with an instinctive tenderness that amazed Daniel. After a quick breakfast, Daniel decided it was time to introduce the puppy to the outdoors. He bundled up in his thick coat, fastening the small leash he'd fashioned from an old piece of rope around the pup's neck. The husky hesitated at the door, its paws sinking into the fresh snow outside. For a moment, it glanced back at Max, who gave an encouraging nudge and then took its first tentative steps into the winter wonderland. The forest was breathtaking in the early light, the snow-covered trees sparkling like a million tiny diamonds. The puppy's hesitation quickly gave way to excitement as it began bounding through the snow, its tiny legs kicking up powder in every direction. Daniel couldn't help but laugh, the sight warming him despite the cold. "You've got some energy for someone so small," he said, as the puppy darted after Max, trying to keep up with the shepherd's long, confident strides. Max led them to a small clearing near the lake, where the frozen expanse glistened under the sun's rays. Daniel paused, his gaze drawn to the spot where they had found the pup just the day before. The memory of the tiny, trembling body in the snow sent a shiver down his spine. "How did you end up there?" he muttered, more to himself than to the dogs. The husky barked, breaking his train of thought, and Daniel turned to see it chasing Max in playful circles. The two dogs seemed to have formed an unbreakable bond overnight, their interactions a seamless blend of trust and joy. Daniel smiled, but the unanswered questions about the pup's origins lingered in the back of his mind. As they made their way back to the cabin, Daniel noticed something unusual in the snow near the tree line, a set of tracks that didn't belong to any of them. He crouched down, examining the faint imprints. They were human, and judging by their depth, they couldn't have been more than a day old. His brow furrowed as he scanned the surrounding forest, but there was no one in sight. Back inside, Daniel couldn't shake the unease that the tracks had stirred. He spread an old map of the area across the kitchen table, marking the spot where they had found the pup. Someone was out there, he murmured, glancing at Max, who was lying by the fire with the husky curled up beside him. But who, and why leave a puppy out in the cold like that? The questions gnawed at him as the day wore on, but the sight of the two dogs sleeping peacefully by the fire brought him a sense of calm. Whatever mysteries surrounded the pup's arrival, Daniel knew one thing for certain. It was safe now, and they were stronger together. As the evening settled in, Daniel prepared a simple dinner, sharing scraps of cooked meat with the two dogs. The husky, now more lively than ever, wagged its tail furiously with every bite, while Max waited patiently for his share. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt alive with the sounds of companionship. Before turning in for the night, Daniel knelt by the fire, his gaze softening as he looked at the husky pup. "We'll figure out where you came from," he said quietly, running a hand over its soft fur. "But for now, you're home." The next morning brought a pale sun that barely cut through the Montana chill. The air was crisp, and the forest beyond the cabin seemed to shimmer with frost. Daniel stood by the kitchen window, sipping his coffee and watching as Max and the husky played in the snow. Their energy was infectious, and for a moment Daniel felt a sense of peace, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the tracks he had found near the tree line. Someone was out there, he murmured to himself, his gaze narrowing as he looked toward the forest. The idea that someone had been nearby, possibly abandoning the puppy, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Deciding to investigate further, Daniel pulled on his coat and boots, grabbing the leash for the husky. "Let's take another look," he called out to Max, who bounded toward him, his breath visible in the cold air. The husky followed, yipping excitedly as if sensing the start of an adventure. The trio retraced their steps to the clearing near the lake, where the tracks had been. Snow had begun to cover the prints, but they were still visible enough to follow. Daniel crouched down, studying them more closely. The spacing suggested a hurried pace, and there was something unsettling about their direction. They seemed to circle the area before leading deeper into the forest. "Why would someone linger here?" Daniel muttered, glancing at Max. The shepherd sniffed the ground, his ears twitching. The husky mimicked him, its nose buried in the snow. Daniel felt a pang of admiration for the little pup, who was already showing signs of alertness and curiosity beyond its weeks. As they followed the tracks, the forest seemed to close in around them. The towering pines cast long shadows, and the faint rustle of branches in the breeze was the only sound. The tracks eventually led to a small, secluded area where Daniel spotted something half buried in the snow. A piece of fabric, torn and weathered. Cautiously, he knelt and picked it up. It was a scrap of plaid, the kind often seen on heavy flannel shirts. The edges were frayed, and faint traces of what looked like blood stained the fabric. Daniel's stomach tightened as he turned it over in his hands. "This just keeps getting stranger," he muttered. Max let out a low growl, drawing Daniel's attention. The shepherd was staring into the trees, his body rigid. Daniel stood quickly, his heart pounding. "What is it, Max?" he whispered, scanning the shadows. The husky moved closer to Max, its small body pressed against the larger dog for reassurance. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, Daniel thought he heard the crunch of snow, a sound that didn't belong to their group. He squinted into the distance, but the dense forest revealed nothing. "Let's head back," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. As they made their way back to the cabin, Daniel couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder. The feeling of being watched lingered, even as the comforting sight of his cabin came into view. Once inside, he locked the door and closed the curtains, his mind racing with questions. Spreading the torn fabric and a hand-drawn map of the area across the table, Daniel tried to make sense of what he'd found. The fabric didn't belong to anyone he knew in the area, and the faint traces of blood only deepened the mystery. "Someone was out there," he said aloud, glancing at Max and the husky, who were curled up near the fire. "And I don't think it was just by accident." The husky lifted its head, its icy blue eyes meeting Daniel's. There was something almost knowing in its gaze, as if it understood the weight of what Daniel was piecing together. Max let out a soft huff, resting his head back on his paws. As night fell, Daniel double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, his unease growing with the darkness. The fabric and map remained on the table, stark reminders of the questions he still couldn't answer. Whatever had happened out there, it wasn't over, but for now they were safe. And as Daniel settled into his chair by the fire, watching Max and the husky drift into peaceful sleep, he resolved to protect them, no matter what. The following night descended with an unsettling stillness. The usual sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through the pines, or the faint rustle of nocturnal animals, were conspicuously absent. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the torn piece of fabric and the map spread before him. The questions swirling in his mind had grown heavier with every passing hour. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws but his eyes alert, while the husky pup dozed near the fireplace, blissfully unaware of the tension. As Daniel added another log to the fire, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Max's ears perked up, his body stiffening as he let out a low growl. Daniel followed his gaze to the window. The dark outline of the trees swayed gently in the wind, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the shepherd's reaction set Daniel's nerves on edge. "What is it, Max?" he whispered, grabbing the flashlight from the counter. Max rose to his feet, his tail low and his posture tense. The husky pup stirred from its sleep, letting out a soft whine as it crawled closer to Max, seeking comfort. Daniel stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin as he scanned the tree line with his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the snow-covered landscape. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and took a few cautious steps toward the forest. Suddenly, Max barked sharply, his voice slicing through the silence. Daniel whipped around, his flashlight catching movement near the edge of the trees. A figure darted out of sight, disappearing into the shadows. His pulse quickened as he realized they weren't alone. Rushing back inside, Daniel locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Max stood by the window, growling softly, while the husky pup pressed against his leg, its small body trembling. "It's okay, little one," Daniel murmured, picking up the pup and holding it close. "We're safe in here." The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet. Daniel stayed awake by the fire, his rifle resting within arm's reach as Max kept watch near the door. The husky eventually fell back asleep, its tiny paws twitching as if running in its dreams. Despite the tension, Daniel felt a swell of determination. Whoever had been out there wasn't going to harm them, not while he and Max were there to protect the pup. By dawn, the intruder had left no trace, but Daniel's resolve had only deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the abandoned fabric and the husky's arrival were connected. As the morning light filtered into the cabin, he stood by the window, watching Max and the pup play in the snow. Max nudged the pup gently, guiding it through the drifts, and Daniel couldn't help but smile despite the lingering unease. "We've got this," he said to himself, his voice firm. Turning back to the table, he folded the map and tucked the piece of fabric into his jacket pocket. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to his newfound family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.